Clara Williams' wrists were bound by cold metal handcuffs, her dignity slipping away in front of a crowd of onlookers. "People like you don't belong in first class anyway," Officer Daniel Scott sneered loudly, his voice cutting through the hum of the busy terminal. His badge gleamed under the bright lights, the metal of the handcuffs tightening a little too firmly around her wrists, just enough to inflict discomfort without leaving marks. Clara, a Harvard-educated attorney and philanthropist, stared directly into the officer's eyes, unshaken, not a trace of fear in her expression. The crowd had stopped moving, people holding up their phones, recording the scene unfolding before them. Officer Scott tightened the handcuffs another notch, his small, petty cruelty meant to establish control. "This is a mistake," Clara said, her voice steady and unwavering. "You'll regret it soon." Reynolds laughed, looking at her like another black woman trying to play the victim. He had no idea who she was, or the storm he was about to unleash by choosing the wrong passenger to harass. She wasn't just any woman, this was Clara Williams, co-founder of a successful global humanitarian foundation, married to the CEO of Skyline Airlines. But he wouldn't know that. He couldn't. And now, he was about to learn exactly what kind of mistake he had made. Before we dive into the story, if you believe in fairness and respect for all, click on the like and subscribe button, and let us know where you're watching from. What happens next will leave you speechless. As Clara stood there, her first-class ticket in hand, the reality of the situation began to sink in. Officer Daniel Scott wasn't just questioning her status as a first-class passenger, he was questioning her very right to be there. Every part of her identity seemed to be under scrutiny in ways that were beyond the surface-level inspection of airport security. Her appearance, her race, her success, it all seemed to matter more than the boarding pass she held. This was more than a random security check, this was an exercise in power. Clara had always been aware of the subtle ways racial bias worked in the world. As an African-American woman who had worked tirelessly to build a career in law, she was no stranger to the microaggressions and dismissive glances that accompanied her every achievement. Yet, in the world of travel, she had come to expect a certain level of respect. As a first-class passenger, she was used to expedited security lines, courteous staff, and minimal delays. But today, things were different. "Ma'am, we need to verify that," Officer Scott repeated, as he motioned for her to step aside. He didn't look at her ticket or examine it with the level of attention it deserved. Instead, his eyes focused on her, scrutinizing her appearance with an intensity that felt invasive. He hadn't done the same to the white passengers who had passed through before her, but he had chosen her to question. Clara stood still, fighting the surge of frustration and anger rising within her. She had been traveling for years and had always been treated with respect, no matter her race or the airline she flew. But now, standing here in the midst of this busy airport terminal, she realized something fundamental: this officer wasn't questioning her as a passenger. He was questioning her presence in this space, the very space that had long been dominated by those who looked like him, not her. "I'm in first class," Clara said, her voice even but firm. "I'm entitled to priority access." Officer Scott's eyes flickered, but he still didn't budge. "We'll need to verify that," he repeated, ignoring her words, as if they didn't matter. This wasn't about following security protocol, it was about something deeper. Clara could sense it in the way the officer treated her differently than the others. She had watched, with growing discomfort, as white passengers had breezed through the priority lane without any issue. There had been no questioning, no need for verification. But when she approached, the scrutiny was immediate. It was clear, Officer Scott had made assumptions about her. He had decided that she, a black woman, didn't belong in first class. He assumed she couldn't afford a premium seat, that she was somehow out of place in this world that had long been reserved for those with money and privilege. Clara felt the sting of his assumptions like a slap across the face. She had earned every ounce of success she had achieved. Her first-class ticket wasn't some mistake, it wasn't something she had simply stumbled into. She had worked years for this, working as a highly respected attorney and philanthropist, fighting for the rights of the underprivileged, and now, standing before this officer, she found herself fighting not for her rights as a passenger, but for her dignity. She tried to stay calm, aware that escalating the situation would only make things worse. But her patience was beginning to wear thin. The officer's actions were no longer just frustrating, they were offensive. He was making her question everything about the world she had worked so hard to build, a world where she believed hard work and integrity should be enough to earn respect, no matter who you were. "I've been watching you let every other passenger with priority access through without question," Clara continued, her voice gaining strength. "I'm simply requesting the same treatment." But Officer Scott wasn't listening. He stepped closer, his body language becoming more confrontational, as if he were trying to assert dominance. "I decide who needs verification, ma'am," he said, his tone sharp. "Step aside, or you'll delay other passengers." Clara could feel the weight of his words, the thinly veiled threat that came with them. She wasn't being treated like a passenger, she was being treated like an inconvenience, an obstacle to the smooth flow of the airport's operations. It wasn't just about security. It was about control. Officer Scott was using his power to remind Clara, and the rest of the travelers watching, that some people like her, didn't belong in the spaces they occupied. They didn't deserve the same privileges as others. "Officer," Clara said, her voice calm but firm. "I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm simply pointing out that your actions aren't consistent. You've allowed others through without verifying their tickets. Why am I being singled out?" The officer didn't respond immediately. His face hardened, and Clara could see the frustration building behind his eyes. He wasn't used to being questioned. He was the one in control, and in that moment, it seemed as though his ego was more important than her rights. Another airport employee, a woman in her 50s named Karen Matthews, who appeared to be a supervisor, walked over, clearly alerted to the situation. Clara could sense the tension in the air, the silent drama unfolding in front of a crowd of people, some of whom had stopped to watch, others recording the interaction with their phones. "Is there a problem here?" Karen asked, glancing between Clara and Officer Scott. "I'd like to report what appears to be discriminatory treatment," Clara said, maintaining her composure despite the unfairness of the situation. "I've been denied access to the priority lane, despite having a first-class ticket. Others with identical documentation have been allowed through without question." Karen Matthews barely glanced at Clara's boarding pass before offering a dismissive response. "Officer Scott is following security protocols," she said, her tone flat. "Some passengers are selected for additional screening based on security algorithms." Clara's brow furrowed. She had heard that excuse before, the so-called random selection that so often seemed to affect passengers like her. "What algorithms are those?" she asked, her voice even but pointed. Karen shifted uncomfortably, clearly not prepared to explain. "I'm not at liberty to discuss security procedures," she said. "But I can assure you it's random selection." Clara raised an eyebrow. "Random?" she asked, her gaze unwavering. "I've been watching for the past 10 minutes, and the pattern doesn't appear random at all." Questioning security procedures can itself be flagged as suspicious behavior, Karen warned, her voice carrying a barely concealed threat. But Clara wasn't backing down. She knew what was happening. She had seen this before in different forms: racism dressed up as procedure, inequality masked as policy. Officer Scott was trying to use his position to assert dominance, to remind her, and anyone else who was watching, that people like her had no place in spaces where privilege and respect should be afforded equally. As Clara stood there, maintaining her composure, she knew this moment was far bigger than just her. It was about a system that had failed, one that perpetuated discrimination and made people like her question their rightful place in society. And while Officer Scott might have been using his badge as a tool to control, Clara knew that the power of truth and dignity was something that could not be taken away. As the tension grew, Vanessa stood still, her hands clasped in front of her, feeling the cool metal of the handcuffs pressing against her wrists. She could sense the eyes of the crowd on her, some recording the scene, others simply watching in stunned silence. Despite everything happening around her, she remained calm. Her breath even, her posture steady. Years of experience in high-pressure situations had taught her that losing control only made things worse. But this was different. This wasn't just an uncomfortable moment, it was a matter of dignity. Vanessa knew that the officer's actions weren't random, nor were they about security protocols. She had been through airport security countless times in her life, from her early days as a young law student to her current work as a co-founder of a successful humanitarian organization. Never had she been treated like this. But today, it wasn't just about her, it was about something far bigger. This was a reminder of the systems in place that reinforced inequality and prejudice. Her mind briefly flickered to her husband, Malcolm. The one person who had always stood by her side, offering support even when the world around them seemed to doubt their worth. He had started from nothing, working as a baggage handler at a young age, and had worked his way up to become the CEO of Skyline Airlines. He understood the value of perseverance and hard work, but also the weight of their shared experiences in a world where people like them often had to fight twice as hard to be recognized. In that moment, Vanessa thought about how far they had come and how much they had both sacrificed. And now, here she was, facing an officer who seemed to see only her skin color and not the accomplishments that had defined her life. But she would not let him strip away her composure. She refused to give him that power. So, she stood there, every inch of her poised and measured, with her thoughts firmly rooted in the idea that her worth wasn't determined by anyone's bias, especially not a man in uniform who had clearly decided, based on her appearance alone, that she didn't belong. As Officer Scott insisted on verifying her ticket, again, Vanessa remained silent. She knew that trying to argue with him in the heat of the moment would only escalate things. Instead, she took a deep breath and focused on maintaining her calm. The small crowd that had gathered around her began murmuring, some appearing uncomfortable, others expressing disbelief at the officer's treatment. It seemed like the injustice was slowly sinking in with those who were witnessing it firsthand. Vanessa wasn't about to back down. She had fought too hard in her life to be intimidated now. She had worked as a lawyer, helping countless families fight against injustice. She had built an organization that sent medical supplies to children in need around the world. Her life's work had been about helping others find their voice when it had been silenced by oppression. This was no different. As Officer Scott continued to focus on her ticket, she couldn't help but notice the way he spoke to the other passengers. White passengers with similar priority boarding passes were waved through without a second thought. Their tickets were barely glanced at, and yet she was being treated as though her presence in first class was somehow a mistake. She had witnessed this pattern before, in subtler forms. She had seen how people of color were often treated as if they didn't belong in spaces reserved for the elite, even when they had the same rights, the same privileges. And yet, in this moment, she felt something stronger than ever, a commitment to stand her ground and not allow the biases of others to dictate how she was treated. "Officer," she said, her voice unwavering. I've noticed you've allowed every other passenger with priority access to go through without question. I'm simply requesting the same treatment." Her tone was not angry, but firm, demanding respect without raising her voice. The officer's expression didn't change. He looked her up and down, his skepticism only growing with every word she said. But Vanessa didn't flinch. She wasn't about to let his prejudices dictate the course of her day, let alone her life. "I'm not accusing you of anything, officer," she continued. "But I'm simply asking for the same respect you've given to everyone else. My boarding pass is legitimate, just like theirs." Her composure was a powerful statement in itself. While the officer grew more defensive, Vanessa remained in control of herself, choosing to respond with measured calm instead of the anger that threatened to bubble to the surface. Her calmness was not a sign of weakness, but rather, it was a reflection of the strength she had cultivated over years of experience navigating situations like this. She had spent her life advocating for those who couldn't advocate for themselves, fighting battles on behalf of the voiceless. This was just another challenge in that long journey. But she was ready for it. The officer's frustration became more palpable as he attempted to maintain his dominance, but Vanessa's unshaken demeanor began to have an effect. People around her were starting to notice the absurdity of the situation. They saw a calm, composed woman standing up to a man who had decided that his authority over her outweighed her rights. Her unwavering poise spoke volumes about her character. This wasn't just a woman who could stand up for herself. This was a woman who had spent her entire life fighting for others, too. In the background, she heard murmurs from bystanders. Some of them were speaking up, others simply watching in quiet disbelief. "She didn't do anything wrong," one voice said. "Why is he doing this?" Vanessa didn't take her eyes off the officer. She knew that his prejudices, his assumptions, and his authority were being tested, not just by her, but by everyone watching. And in that moment, she understood something deeply important. Her calm was her weapon. It was a reminder that dignity could not be stripped away by someone who didn't understand her worth. Her calmness wasn't just an internal strength, it was a challenge to a system that so often worked against people like her. Clara had always believed in the power of staying calm in the face of adversity, but as the officer's attempts to intimidate her grew more blatant, she felt a shift happening around her. She could feel the eyes of others on her. She could feel their silent support. And she knew that this wasn't just about one incident. It was a moment that had the potential to ignite a bigger conversation about power, prejudice, and respect. The calmness she displayed was not simply a personal response, it was a challenge to the system that had been allowed to perpetuate inequality. As the seconds ticked by, Vanessa's calmness began to feel like a quiet defiance. And she knew, as did the onlookers, that this moment would not be forgotten. This was more than just a fight for priority access to a security lane. This was a stand for fairness, for dignity, and for the idea that no one should ever be made to feel small simply because of the color of their skin. As the situation unfolded, the tension in the terminal continued to build. Clara stood there, unflinching, her eyes locked on Officer Scott as he continued to challenge her presence in the priority security lane. The crowd around them had grown, with people whispering, recording, and exchanging uncertain glances. But Clara remained resolute, her composure never wavering. She knew that in this moment, the world was watching, not just her, but what happened when people were forced to confront injustice in real time. It was in this charged atmosphere that Clara reached for her phone and made the call. She didn't raise her voice, but her words carried an unmistakable weight. "Malcolm," she said, her voice calm yet urgent, "I need you at Terminal A, security checkpoint. Officer Scott is trying to arrest me on fabricated charges. I'm fine, but I need you here now." On the other end of the line, Malcolm Williams, CEO of Skyline Airlines, a man known for his quiet authority and unshakable resolve, immediately recognized the gravity of the situation. His calm demeanor, forged from years of running one of the country's largest airlines, remained steady even as the fire of anger burned in his chest. He had worked for every inch of success in his life, from humble beginnings as a baggage handler to the heights of corporate leadership. Yet, none of his accomplishments had prepared him for this moment, his wife being harassed in public simply because of the color of her skin. Malcolm's voice, though measured, carried the authority of a man who had built something from the ground up, a man whose voice commanded respect. "I'm on my way. Don't engage any further, Clara. I'll handle this." Clara nodded, her grip on the phone tightening slightly, but she said nothing more. She didn't need to. Malcolm understood. She had always known he would come through in a moment like this, not because of his status, but because of the quiet integrity and sense of justice he carried with him. He wasn't just a businessman, he was a man who valued fairness, who had spent his life breaking down barriers for others, including the employees at Skyline Airlines who had seen firsthand how he treated everyone, regardless of their background. Malcolm's journey from the moment he hung up the phone to the airport was swift. His presence, calm but powerful, immediately altered the course of events. As the head of Skyline Airlines, he was not only Clara's husband but also the employer of many of the airport's staff, including those working at the very terminal where this confrontation had taken place. But it wasn't just his position that gave him power in this moment, it was his unwavering commitment to fairness, respect, and equality. He had learned early in life the value of standing up for what was right. Raised in a modest home, Malcolm had worked countless hours to pay his way through college. He had seen firsthand the struggle of trying to carve out a place in a world that often looked down on people who didn't fit the established mold. But Malcolm had used his intelligence, resilience, and work ethic to rise above it. He had founded Skyline Airlines with one plane, a handful of employees, and a vision to build something that would not only succeed but also treat people with dignity and respect. His success wasn't just about financial growth, it was about lifting others up and ensuring that everyone had a seat at the table. As he entered the terminal, he was not just a CEO, he was a man coming to defend his wife, a woman who had been wronged, who had been humiliated in a place where people were supposed to be treated fairly, regardless of their race. As he approached the scene, the atmosphere shifted. The bustling terminal seemed to quiet for a moment, the crowd sensing the change. Clara had remained calm, but now, with Malcolm by her side, the balance of power had shifted. Clara's composure didn't falter as she saw her husband approach. She had always known that Malcolm would be her rock in difficult situations, and this moment was no exception. His arrival was like the calm before the storm that was about to hit Officer Scott, who still hadn't fully realized the gravity of the situation. "Clara," Malcolm said, his voice soft yet filled with authority as he approached her. "What's going on here?" Clara briefly explained the situation, recounting how Officer Scott had treated her differently from other passengers and how he had refused to acknowledge her first-class ticket without unnecessary scrutiny. Malcolm's jaw tightened as he listened, his professional demeanor never breaking, but the anger in his eyes was unmistakable. Turning to Officer Scott, Malcolm's voice grew firmer. "Officer, I need to speak with you." The officer, who had been so confident moments before, suddenly seemed smaller in Malcolm's presence. "Yes, sir," he stammered, clearly uneasy now that he realized who he was speaking to. Malcolm's gaze was steady, but his words were sharp. "You've made a grave mistake," he said calmly. "You've harassed my wife in front of a crowd, denied her the respect she deserves, and based your actions on nothing but prejudice. I am the CEO of Skyline Airlines. This is my wife, and I will not stand for this kind of treatment." Officer Scott's face drained of color. He had no idea that the woman he had treated so dismissively was married to one of the most powerful men in the airport. His initial arrogance now seemed foolish, and he was suddenly aware of how deeply he had misjudged the situation. He fumbled for words, but they didn't come. He had crossed a line, and there was no going back. I wasn't aware, Officer Scott stuttered, but Malcolm cut him off. Of course, you weren't. You didn't bother to check. You didn't think to verify who she was. You assumed she didn't belong in first class because of her skin color, Malcolm said, his voice growing firmer. And that's where you went wrong. As Malcolm spoke, Karen Matthews, the terminal supervisor who had stood by silently, stepped forward. She seemed nervous now, having witnessed the shift in power. Her eyes flickered from Officer Scott to Malcolm, then back to the ground. Mr. Williams, I want to apologize for the confusion, Karen said, her voice shaking. We'll investigate the matter immediately. Malcolm's eyes narrowed. This isn't about a simple investigation. This is about ensuring that no one, no matter their race or background, is subjected to this kind of treatment in this airport or any other airport under my company's purview. With that, Malcolm took a step back, his eyes never leaving Officer Scott. The officer was clearly rattled, but his hesitation was too late. The damage had been done. Malcolm knew this was bigger than one officer's mistake. It was a systemic issue, and he wasn't going to let it slide. I'm going to ensure that this is addressed properly, Malcolm continued. And I want to make sure this never happens again. To my wife, or anyone else. As the scene unfolded, it was clear that this was just the beginning. Malcolm's intervention had not only stopped Officer Scott's discriminatory actions in their tracks, but it had also set in motion a chain of events that would demand accountability and change. In that moment, as Clara stood by her husband's side, she felt a sense of both relief and pride. She knew this was only the first step, but it was a step towards something bigger, something that would resonate far beyond this airport. The tension in the terminal was palpable, and it wasn't just because of the confrontation between Clara Williams and Officer Scott. The event had already begun to reverberate far beyond the airport, making it clear that the issue at hand was not isolated to one individual or one incident. This was about something much bigger, a system that perpetuated inequality, a culture that allowed discrimination to thrive in places where fairness should be the standard. And, with Malcolm Williams stepping in, it became evident that things were about to change, not just for Officer Scott, but for everyone involved. In the immediate aftermath of the confrontation, it became clear that Malcolm, with his influence as CEO of Skyline Airlines, was going to make sure that this incident wouldn't fade into the background. Clara, standing beside him, could sense the ripple effect of what had just happened, the beginning of a larger conversation that had been long overdue. They both understood the weight of the moment, and while the situation had escalated quickly, it also provided an opportunity to shine a light on the deep-seated biases that still lingered in everyday life, especially in public spaces like airports. Malcolm's next steps were decisive. He knew that if the change they hoped for was to happen, it couldn't just be about reprimanding one officer. This needed to be a moment of transformation, not only for Skyline Airlines but for the airport and other institutions that had allowed this kind of treatment to persist. Clara, Malcolm said, his voice calm but filled with purpose, we're going to make sure that this doesn't just stop here. This isn't just about Officer Scott. It's about making sure that every passenger, regardless of their race or background, is treated with the dignity they deserve. We'll be taking this further. Clara nodded, her trust in Malcolm unwavering. She had seen him stand up for what was right time and time again. This was no different. She understood that for lasting change to happen, it would require systemic efforts. It wasn't just about calling out one person's bias, it was about creating an environment where those biases were no longer tolerated, and where people felt safe, respected, and equal. The first step, of course, was a formal investigation. The airport had to be held accountable. Malcolm wasted no time in calling for a full review of the incident, and more importantly, he demanded that the airport institute new training procedures for all employees. This included not just security officers, but also ticket agents, customer service staff, and everyone who interacted with passengers in any capacity. The purpose of the training was clear: to address racial biases and ensure that every person who entered the airport would be treated fairly, without fear of discrimination. The investigation into Officer Scott was swift. It became clear to both Malcolm and the airport authorities that the officer's actions were not an isolated incident. His behavior was symptomatic of a larger issue that had been allowed to fester under the surface for too long. Interviews with other passengers, some of whom had witnessed the encounter and others who had experienced similar treatment in the past, painted a troubling picture. It wasn't just about this one officer's mistake, it was about a culture of prejudice that had been quietly tolerated for years. As the investigation progressed, Malcolm pushed for transparency. He wanted to ensure that the outcome was not swept under the rug or hidden behind closed doors. If we're going to make real change, he insisted, it has to be public. The people need to see that this isn't just talk. We need to show them that we are committed to making things right. And so, the investigation was made public, and its findings were shared with the community. The results were not only shocking to the public but also to the airport's leadership. It became clear that Officer Scott's actions were part of a broader issue within the airport's security and customer service departments. Many employees, like Scott, had never been properly trained on how to address issues of racial bias, and some had never been encouraged to examine their own prejudices. The airport's leadership, once defensive, began to see the need for change. It was time to take responsibility and ensure that this kind of behavior was never tolerated again. Malcolm's insistence on transparency, coupled with his leadership and the evidence from the investigation, helped push the airport management to act decisively. The first major change was the implementation of mandatory anti-bias training for all employees. This training wasn't just a brief seminar, it was a deep dive into understanding racial inequality, the ways in which it manifests in everyday interactions, and how employees could actively work to combat their own biases. The training was conducted by independent experts who had worked in the field of racial equity for decades, ensuring that it wasn't just lip service, but a meaningful step toward real change. But Malcolm didn't stop there. He also demanded that the airport adopt a more transparent system for filing complaints and holding employees accountable. Passengers would now have an easy, accessible way to report discrimination or inappropriate behavior, and those complaints would be taken seriously. The airport was to set up an independent committee to review these complaints and make recommendations for improvement. This wasn't just about addressing individual incidents, it was about creating a systemic process to prevent future occurrences and ensure that all employees were held to the highest standards of respect and professionalism. As part of the reforms, the airport also began to diversify its workforce, focusing on bringing in employees from different racial and cultural backgrounds to better reflect the communities they served. This was a significant step toward creating an environment where everyone could feel that they were truly represented. Through it all, Clara and Malcolm remained at the forefront of this movement. Clara, with her unwavering commitment to justice, continued her humanitarian work, now using her platform to speak out against discrimination in all its forms. She made sure that the Williams Foundation, which she co-led with Malcolm, would work alongside the airport to develop educational resources for the public, helping them understand their rights and how they could address discrimination when they saw it. Malcolm, too, used his influence to push for broader systemic change. Skyline Airlines was one of the largest carriers in the country, and Malcolm used the company's significant presence to drive change not just in the airport where the incident occurred but across the entire airline industry. He began a nationwide initiative to address discrimination in air travel, starting with mandatory anti-bias training for all airline employees and continuing with efforts to partner with other organizations working to create systemic change. While the changes at the airport were significant, they were just the beginning. The real work was in making sure that the momentum didn't fizzle out, that the system would continue to evolve, and that future generations would benefit from the progress they had made. For Clara and Malcolm, this was a long-term commitment to creating a world where fairness and equality weren't just ideals but lived realities. As time went on, the results became clear. The airport began to see a shift in the way passengers were treated. Complaints about racial discrimination decreased, and employees reported feeling better equipped to handle difficult situations. The community began to take notice, and while the journey wasn't over, it was evident that Clara and Malcolm had sparked something important, the beginning of real, lasting change. Months passed since the incident in the airport, but the lessons it taught remained at the forefront of Clara and Malcolm Williams' minds. What began as a personal confrontation between Clara and a discriminatory officer had ignited a movement, one that transcended the walls of the airport and extended into institutions, policies, and conversations across the country. The changes were gradual, but they were undeniable. This wasn't just about a single mistake by an officer. It was about a system that had been broken for too long, and now, Clara and Malcolm were determined to ensure that the future would be different. For Clara, the incident had been a wake-up call, not just for herself, but for the countless people who were affected by everyday acts of bias. As a woman of color, she had navigated a world that often overlooked or undervalued her contributions. She had spent her career fighting for others, advocating for the underserved and those without a voice. Yet, she had never fully understood how pervasive discrimination could be in even the most mundane of interactions until she found herself the target of it. The experience had left a mark, but it also gave her the fuel to push forward, to make sure that those who came after her would not have to face the same indignities. Malcolm, too, had learned from the events. He had always been committed to fairness, but the situation with Clara made him see just how deeply ingrained inequality was in society. Malcolm had spent his life building a business that focused not only on profitability but also on ensuring that his employees were treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their background. Skyline Airlines had always prided itself on being a company where employees and customers were treated fairly. Yet, the events at the airport had shown him that even institutions with the best of intentions could still fall short if they weren't actively working to identify and correct biases. Clara and Malcolm knew that the reforms they had worked so hard to implement were just the beginning. True change, they realized, came when people not only acknowledged the issues at hand but also actively worked to create a culture of fairness and equality in every aspect of life. They understood that equality wasn't just about changing laws or policies, it was about changing hearts and minds, about creating a world where people of all backgrounds, races, and identities were not only accepted but celebrated. The work was far from over, but they had seen the power of speaking up, of standing firm in the face of injustice. When Clara had calmly stood her ground against Officer Scott, she had set in motion a ripple effect that would not only change the way she was treated but would also change the way others were treated. People who had witnessed the incident had come forward, sharing their own stories of discrimination and their desire for a more equitable world. Employees at the airport and within Skyline Airlines had undergone training to help them identify their own biases and learn how to treat every person with respect, regardless of their race or background. Clara and Malcolm knew that these efforts, while crucial, were just one piece of the puzzle. As part of their ongoing work, Clara used her position at the Williams Foundation to help support policies and initiatives that promoted racial equity in various sectors, from healthcare to education. She worked with other organizations to create educational resources for people, particularly in underrepresented communities, to help them understand their rights and advocate for themselves in situations like the one she had faced. These resources weren't just for those who had suffered discrimination, they were for everyone, so that the lessons of fairness and equality could be passed down to future generations. One of the most powerful lessons Clara and Malcolm learned was the importance of creating systems that are transparent and accountable. They pushed for legislation that would require businesses and public institutions to report their diversity and inclusion efforts regularly. These reports would not just be a way to track progress, but a way to hold organizations accountable for their actions and ensure they were doing the work necessary to build inclusive environments. Clara and Malcolm knew that without real accountability, change could easily become a passing trend. As the changes continued, the impact was felt far beyond the airport and Skyline Airlines. Clara's advocacy and Malcolm's leadership set an example for others in positions of power. They showed that, when you use your influence for good, you can change not just your immediate environment but create a ripple effect that can touch countless lives. The couple had learned that true leadership wasn't about being in charge, it was about using your platform to lift others up and create opportunities for everyone to thrive. Looking back on everything that had transpired, Clara and Malcolm could see the transformation that had taken place. It wasn't always easy, and it didn't happen overnight, but they knew they had sparked a movement that would continue long after they were gone. The world was far from perfect, but with each step they took, they were helping to build a more just, equitable society. The lessons they had learned, and the ones they had taught others, would continue to resonate for years to come. For Clara and Malcolm, this was never about personal glory or recognition, it was about making sure that everyone, no matter their race, background, or station in life, was treated with the respect they deserved. It was about ensuring that no one would ever have to face the kind of humiliation Clara had endured at the airport, and that, when they did speak out, they would be heard. Above all, they understood that fairness and equality were not just ideals, they were principles that needed to be lived out every single day, by everyone. One of the most powerful lessons from this story is the importance of standing up for fairness and equality, even when it seems difficult. Clara's calm composure in the face of discrimination shows us that we don't have to react with anger or frustration when confronted with injustice. Instead, we can use our voice and integrity to demand respect and fairness. It's a reminder that every person, no matter their race, background, or status, deserves to be treated with dignity. As we grow older, we accumulate wisdom and experience, and with that comes a responsibility to stand for what's right. We've seen and lived through much of history's challenges, and we know that change happens when people take action. In a world that can sometimes feel divided, we can be the ones to bring people together, whether by speaking out against injustice or by quietly modeling the respect and fairness we want to see. This story teaches us that it's never too late to make a difference, and that every step toward equality, no matter how small, matters. The lessons of fairness and kindness should guide us in every interaction, ensuring that we leave a legacy of respect for future generations.